Number 11. Albanian bunkers. Cold War-era bunkers are a pretty common sight in Albania. That's because thousands of them were built between 1968 and 1983 under the radical communist leader Enver Hoxha, who was convinced that an attack was imminent. Hoxha was extreme in his ways. To give you an idea, he believed that Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong were too soft. So he's clearly a madman. Fearing an invasion from both the West and the Soviet Union, he adhered to an isolationist policy. The paranoid leader wanted a bunker built for every 4 of the country's residents. Although he never achieved this goal, over 173,000 concrete bunkers were built during his 20-year rule. The dome-shaped structures were manufactured at a factory and delivered by truck. Albania's resources were already scarce when Hoxha embarked on his so-called bunkerization project. The massive endeavor stretched the country's resources to their limit, and they were never even used for their intended purpose. Nobody had a reason to use them until the Kosovo War and the Albanian Civil War during the 1990s, and even then their use was limited. A few of the bunkers have been removed, but many still dot the landscape today. Some have been converted into hostels, homes, and museums, while the rest are simply rotting in place. Number 10. Lvivska Brama. The Ukrainian capital of Kiev is the country's most populated city. It's seen steady growth for more than a century, and it's projected to grow even more in the coming years. Naturally, the city's subway system has expanded to accommodate more people. But not everything has gone according to plan, and sometimes entire projects were left unfinished, leaving behind deserted pathways and platforms that were never used. Take, for example, the ghost station Lvivska Brama. Construction began during the early 1990s, but funds began to run low. On top of that, developers couldn't agree on where to place the entrance, so they decided to simply abandon the project. There's a metro line running through Lvivska Brama, and passengers can see the mysterious incomplete structure as their train passes through. There have been numerous proposals to finish building the station, but it hasn't happened yet, and nobody knows if it ever will. Number 9. RUBJERG KNUDE Lighthouse. When you think of Denmark, you probably don't think of the desert. But shifting sands along the country's coastline are swallowing up an old lighthouse in North Jutland that's been abandoned since 2002. Known as the RUBJERG KNUDE Lighthouse, the deserted 75-foot-tall, 23-meter structure sits roughly 200 feet, 60 meters above the water on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was built in 1899 and operated until 1968. For several decades afterward, the lighthouse housed a museum and coffee shop. But sand kept accumulating around the building, and it became a problem. While North Sea winds blow sand toward the lighthouse, the coast erodes by 5 feet, 1.5 meters every year. As a result, the structure's surroundings have changed dramatically. Several buildings nearby were damaged beyond repair and were removed in 2009, but the lighthouse still stands for now. In 2019, it was moved inland in a bid to preserve it for as long as possible. By then, erosion had brought the lighthouse just feet away from the cliff's edge, and the elements threatened to topple it into the sea. In fact, this is precisely what would have happened if it had stayed where it was. Experts estimate that the lighthouse will remain safely in its current position until around 2060, at which point officials will have to make yet another decision about what to do with it. Number 8. Pennsylvania Turnpike. When it opened in 1940, the Pennsylvania Turnpike was nicknamed the Tunnel Highway because it passed through 7 tunnels. It wasn't very efficiently designed, however. In both directions, the highway was reduced to a single lane through each tunnel. Within a decade, the turnpike was chronically congested, and there were frequent traffic jams at the entrances to the tunnels. In late 1968, the problematic 13-mile, 21-kilometer stretch of road was abandoned in favor of a newly built bypass. It's been closed to vehicle traffic ever since, and nature has reclaimed the surrounding area. In what looks like a scene from a post-apocalyptic film, the once bustling road and tunnels run straight through the middle of the woods. Plans have been in the works for several years to turn the disused highway into a bike path. Whether or not it'll actually happen remains to be seen. But even in its dilapidated state, the road is open to the public for those who want to take their chances on cracked pavement that hasn't been maintained in over 50 years. Would you take your chances? Number 7. The Macedonium. In the year 1903, a group of Macedonian revolutionaries led an uprising against the Ottoman Empire in a bid for their independence. They had some initial success and established a local administration called the Kruševo Republic. But the Ottomans fought back with overwhelming force and quelled the rebellion. Afterward, they punished the dissenters by destroying their homes and executing people en masse. Historians estimate that at least 9,000 homes were ruined, as many as 4,600 people were killed, and thousands more became homeless. 71 years later, in 1974, a memorial to the uprising opened in North Macedonia. Nicknamed the Macedonium, the bizarre round structure is covered in protruding oval windows. It somewhat resembles a giant virus and bears no obvious connection to the rebellion at first glance. The memorial sits atop a hill overlooking the city of Kruševo from 4,000 feet, 1,219 meters above. It houses the tomb of Nikola Karev, the president of the short-lived Kruševo Republic. Outside, there's a series of sculptures called Breaking the Chains, which symbolize the freedom that Macedonians eventually achieved. On that note, the Macedonium is fascinating for its uniqueness, but it would admittedly be impossible to know what the strange site is about just by looking at it. Number 6. Old Car City. A 32-acre, 13-hectare property in White, Georgia is home to one of the world's biggest car junkyards. Known as Old Car City, it's filled with abandoned vintage cars covered in overgrowth. The Lewis family has owned the site since 1931. It originally consisted of a general store and then became a used car parts dealer. Over time, the land became wildly overrun with cars and car parts, to the tune of 4,000 vehicles, most of which date back between the 1950s and the 1980s. There are cars, trucks, and even school buses. As the cars rusted out, nature took over and the plant life became entangled with the colossal collection of clunkers. In what most people might regard as a heaping sea of junk, the original owner's son, Dean Lewis, saw a unique opportunity. He turned the property into an attraction for photographers and welcomes both seasoned professionals and enthusiasts to come and explore. Lewis created 6 miles, 10 kilometers of trails and put up signs for visitors to follow, and thousands of people have come to see the sprawling scrapyard for themselves. Old Car City's fame and its status as a museum may make it seem commercialized, but the vehicles have sat frozen in time for decades. One of the most popular displays at the site is the 2-ton flower pot, a 1939 Chevy with tree branches sprouting through its busted-out windshield from inside. Number 5. McNabb's Island. Off the coast of Nova Scotia in Halifax Harbour, Canada, there's an island filled with abandoned modern-era structures and military installations. Known as McNabb's Island, its history goes at least as far back as the 18th century, when it was used by fishermen and went by the name Cornwallis Island. A man named Peter McNabb settled there during the 1780s, and his family lived on the island until 1934. No major settlements were built there after they left. Since World War II, McNabb Island has remained mostly abandoned. The ruins there today consist of several military forts, the foundations of houses built by early settlers, and a cemetery that contains the remains of some of the island's first inhabitants. There's also an old soda factory, disused gun batteries, the ruins of a large Victorian garden, a lighthouse, and more. McNabb Island spans roughly 980 acres, 395 hectares, making it the biggest island in Halifax Harbour. Most of it is owned by the federal government and the province of Nova Scotia, and several of its historic structures are protected landmarks. Only 3% of McNabb Island is privately owned. You may be surprised to learn that there are still a handful of permanent residents there, but for the most part, it's filled with reminders of how much more populated it used to be. Number 4. DAMEN Silos. Chicago was once home to the country's largest grain storage center. Known as the DAMEN Silos, the site is made up of a network of interlocking 15-story silos that were built in 1906. They were owned by the Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad and had enough room to store 400,000 bushels of grain. The DAMEN Silos closed after a massive explosion and fire in 1977 damaged them beyond repair. Since then, they've become an attraction for urban explorers, graffiti artists, and troublesome teens. In the basement beneath the silos, there's a series of dark rooms and tunnels, thousands of square feet of them, according to photographer Mike Kinch, whose images were published in Block Club Chicago. Speaking with the news outlet, he explained that the tunnels run beneath half the 24-acre, 10-hectare site and that someone could easily get lost in them. It's actually illegal to explore this seemingly post-apocalyptic landmark, but plenty of people are curious enough to take their chances on getting caught. Those who are determined enough to explore the DAMEN Silos can find instructions on how to access the site if they look hard enough. Number 3. BUZLUDZHA Monument. Back in 1891, a group of socialists in Bulgaria met in secret to form an organized movement called the Bulgarian Social Democratic Party. The organization paved the way for what would eventually become the Bulgarian Communist Party. But don't get socialism and communism confused. They're extremely different. Nearly a century later, in 1974, construction began on a monument dedicated to that first meeting. Known as the Monument House of the Bulgarian Communist Party, or the BUZLUDZHA Monument, the futuristic structure stands on a remote peak in the central Balkan Mountains. In order to build it, engineers had to create a level foundation. They did this by using TNT to blast away nearly 530,000 cubic feet, 15,000 cubic meters of rock, and reducing the mountain's height by 30 feet, 9.1 meters. Building the actual monument cost the equivalent of $35 million today. Like the many state-sponsored communist buildings, the BUZLUDZHA Monument has a paradoxically vintagey yet space-age feel to it. It's visibly outdated and decaying, but contains elements of what its designers envisioned as the architecture of the future. Inside, there's a collection of mosaics commemorating the Bulgarian Communist Party history. Sadly, 1/5 of the artwork has been destroyed by vandalism, time, and the elements. The monument wasn't open for very long. It was finished being built in 1981 and closed when communism fell in 1989. All maintenance of the site ended there, and the building has since fallen into disrepair. Its structural integrity is compromised, and visitors aren't allowed because it's dangerous to go inside. Number 2. Historic Cemetery 3 and Crematorium. There's a road in the German town of Dessau that runs through an old and mostly abandoned cemetery. Known simply as Cemetery 3, it's filled with fallen tombstones and urns. Some of the statues are rather beautiful, while others contain disturbing inscriptions. There are monuments to soldiers who died in both World Wars, as well as a memorial dedicated to 56 workers who perished in a factory explosion in 1918. Most of them were women and girls. The most shocking feature of the historic Cemetery 3 is a domed building that looks like a chapel from the outside. Once you enter the deceptively quaint structure, however, it immediately becomes clear that it once functioned as a crematorium. Between 1910 and the late 1980s, an estimated 100,000 bodies were burned there. At one point, a new wing was added on to the busy crematorium, and that also remains at the site today. The buildings are still filled with paperwork, old telephones, and the equipment that was used for burning human remains. Entering the crematorium has been likened to stepping into a horror film. But if you're into that sort of thing, you may want to visit this protected historic landmark. Number 1. Stratiste Memorial Complex. In rural Serbia, northeast of Belgrade, there's a long road leading past farming communities to an abandoned bronze and concrete monument situated along the Tamis River. Known as the Stratiste Memorial Complex, it was built to commemorate an event known as the Pančevo Holocaust or the Jabuka Massacre. Between 1941 and 1945, fascists executed an estimated 10,000 Serbs, Jews, and Roma near the site. The memorial opened in 1981 in what was then Yugoslavia. At the time, it consisted of a small museum, an amphitheater, numerous plaques and sculptures, and several other structures. Today, the site is in poor condition, neglected, and covered in overgrowth. Sadly, the derelict complex has been vandalized and robbed nearly a dozen times since 2013. 2 3-ton, 2.7 tons bronze decorations were stolen, along with all the site's electrical parts and wiring. The museum's artifacts and displays are all gone, and its features were covered in graffiti. The criminals responsible for these acts were never caught. Nature and time seem to have made up for anything that deviants haven't had the opportunity to destroy. Anyone who wants to visit the memorial will have to find it on their own because there's no signage to guide people there. And visitors will also have to rely on their Google skills to learn about and interpret the site because there's certainly no information available there. In 2018, the memorial was cleaned up and fixed to the extent that it realistically could be, but it's nowhere near as nice as it was before it became an afterthought and fell into disrepair. Number 10. Kentucky Ghost Ship. There's a creepy old ship rotting in the middle of nowhere, USA. It began life over 100 years ago as a luxury yacht used by an unknown wealthy owner. Throughout the years, the yacht ended up having many different names and being used as many different types of ships. It was used by rich people for yachting, it was drafted for anti-submarine duty during World War I, and she even helped the famous inventor Thomas Edison to do experimental work. After the war, when she was known as the USS Sachem, the ship turned into a fishing boat, and then much later, it began work in the tourism sector by ferrying tourists through the New York harbors. But after such an exciting life, the many-named ship came to a sad and miserable end. It was purchased by an unknown person in Kentucky for just $7,500. This was about 30 years ago, so it was quite a bargain of a deal, even back then. Unfortunately, when the ship sailed west to Kentucky, for whatever reason, it wound up abandoned in a creek near the Ohio River. It's been there for at least 3 decades, with some stumbling upon the rusted wreckage every now and again. It's come a long way, but there's really no salvaging it at this point. There are trees growing through its hull, it's completely gutted, and it's beached on a random creek shore hours away from civilization. Number 9. The H.M.S. Terror. The H.M.S. Terror is by far the most spectacular lost ship ever to be found. It was one of 2 ships under the leadership of Sir John Franklin back in 1845. They were part of an expedition to discover the Northwest Passage. Instead, all they discovered was horror, hence the name of the ship. The H.M.S. Terror and its sister ship, the H.M.S. Erebus, got stranded in the Arctic ice. The crews tried to escape and ended up resorting to cannibalism, and sadly, none of them made it out alive. For 170 years, the H.M.S. Terror remained frozen in a block of ice. It wasn't until 2016 that archaeologists found the lost vessel and began studying it. According to Parks Canada, archaeologists used remotely operated vehicles to look through the interior of the historic vessel. The lead archaeologist on the project, Ryan Harris, says the ship is amazingly intact. The underwater archaeologists were able to explore 20 cabins and compartments, finding the ship in the exact same condition it had been in when it was abandoned by the crew. Glasses were still sitting on the shelves, beds were made, there were scientific instruments waiting to be used, and there were even charts and journals spread across tables. Number 8. The Griffin. The wreckage of a ship that suffered a curse over 350 years ago has finally been found. The ship was called the Griffin, and it vanished during its maiden voyage in the year 1679. Shipwreck hunters have been looking for it for centuries. The Griffin was originally constructed for a French explorer who was planning to find a route through the American Great Lakes to China. This is obviously impossible, but they didn't know that back then. The ship was in the middle of delivering a cargo of furs when the crew got into some trouble with an Iroquois tribe. A shaman from the tribe allegedly cursed the ship, and before it could deliver its cargo, it went missing. The ship was finally found by Steve and Kathy Libert, at least so they claim. They haven't been able to identify the ship with 100% certainty, but they did find a colonial-aged shipwreck sitting at the bottom of Lake Michigan, near Poverty Island. It matches the description of the Griffin, though there's honestly not much left of it anymore. The entire ship has rotted, with only the bones of its wooden hull still intact. As for how the ship sank, we still don't know. Some historians believe it was taken down during a violent storm. Others say the Iroquois tribe didn't actually curse the vessel, but instead boarded the ship, killed the crew, and then set the thing on fire. What do you think caused this ship to sink? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 7. The SS Cotopaxi. A lost ship called the SS Cotopaxi has been discovered after vanishing near the Bermuda Triangle almost a century ago. It happened on November 29, 1925. The SS Cotopaxi left Charleston, South Carolina with a crew of 32 men. It was on its way to Havana, Cuba. However, the ship never got there. As it neared the Bermuda Triangle, it vanished without a trace. This was one of the original disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle that sparked rumors of paranormal activity. There have been ghost stories, tales of aliens abducting the ship, and all kinds of nonsense going on for 95 years. But finally, in 2020, a team of shipwreck hunters identified the remains of the boat. The ship was discovered in a place called Bear Wreck, which is infamous for containing sunken vessels. It's kind of a marine graveyard. The team of marine biologists were able to locate the exact place where the ship sank by using court records and insurance paperwork from 1925. While sifting through all this paperwork, they discovered that the boat was under financial pressure at the time. This means it probably left port without the equipment it needed to get through a tropical storm. When it encountered bad weather, the ship went down. It wasn't aliens or ghosts, it was just poor planning and Mother Nature. Number 6. Ancient military vessel. Divers have uncovered a mysterious ancient military vessel submerged off the coast of Alexandria in Egypt. The ship was once docked at the port of Tanis Heraklion, one of the greatest Mediterranean cities in ancient times. Today, the city is entirely submerged. It's under dozens of feet of water in the Egyptian Bay of Abu Qir. According to the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, the ship had been docked beside the megalithic Temple of Amun when disaster struck in the year 331 BC. The ship was 80 feet, 24 meters long, probably a fearsome military vessel used to guard the bay. But without warning, a great earthquake shook the city, causing this temple to break and collapse sideways. This thing was so big that when it collapsed, it took out the military ship with huge chunks of falling stone. At the same time that the ship was being broken into pieces by the collapsing temple, the earthquake caused a tsunami to breach the shoreline and pull the entire city into the water. It was just as catastrophic as when the volcano erupted and destroyed the Italian city of Pompeii. Within just minutes, the city of Tanis Heraklion was underwater. Archaeologists uncovered this sunken port city a few decades ago, but it wasn't until recently that they found the bones of the military ship. It was found under about 16 feet, 4.8 meters of hardened clay, with massive blocks of stone still pinning it to the seabed. Number 5. The H.L. Hunley submarine. The H.L. Hunley was a submarine for the Confederate States of America that battled during the American Civil War. It was the first combat submarine in history to ever sink a fully equipped warship, the USS Housatonic. But it was this historic success that resulted in the sinking of the H.L. Hunley. It wasn't the warship that did it in, but rather the fact that when the submarine tried to flee the scene, it got lost and sank before the crew could ever get it back to base. But believe it or not, the ship actually sank 3 times during its short career. The submarine was built in Alabama, with its first sailing in 1863. Its first sinking was on August 29th the same year. 5 members were killed, but the submarine was salvaged. Then in October of that same year, 8 crew members were killed and the ship sank yet again. It was recovered a second time and then sunk a third time after destroying the USS Housatonic. The third time it was lost for good. The ship wasn't found again until 1995. One of the biggest problems with locating the ship was that nobody knew where it went under. The crew had gotten lost and were unable to send any kind of coordinates to base. 5 years after the H.L. Hunley was found, it was raised from its watery grave and put on display at the Warren Lash Conservation Center in South Carolina. Number 4. The Murmansk. The Murmansk was once a devastating Soviet cruiser that functioned during the Cold War. It was a Sverdlov-class light cruiser, part of the Soviet Union's Northern Fleet. At the time of its creation back in the early 50s, enemies of Russia were actually terrified of the ship because it was so advanced. Unfortunately for Russia, it ended up being a naval embarrassment. The Murmansk smashed into a Norwegian fjord in the middle of the 1990s and got stranded. And this was after 40 years of service in which the Murmansk didn't really accomplish much at all. By the time it crashed on December 24, 1994, it had already been labeled obsolete. In fact, it had been sold as scrap metal to India. It was during the transfer that the old cruiser broke free of the tow rope, ran aground, and then half sank. The ship sat there abandoned for over a decade until 2012, when the dismantling started. A demolition contractor from Scandinavia, AFDCom, had to build an enormous seawall around the shipwreck just so that they could dismantle it from land. By 2013, every last piece of the failed Soviet cruiser was taken away. Number 3. German torpedo ship. The lost wreckage of a missing German torpedo ship was recently discovered inside of a sea cave. Oddly enough, Darren Murray, a professional explorer, was looking for 2 different wrecks when he stumbled upon the torpedo ship. It originally sank in December of 1920 off the coast of Roundham Head in the United Kingdom. Darren found the creepy wreckage of the vessel inside a cave that can only be accessed from the ocean beneath the cliff bluffs. It's not exactly a place frequented by ordinary people. In fact, the wreckage has been hiding inside of the sea cave for at least 100 years. But how did the ship get into the cave in the first place? The vessel fought during World War I and survived, only to be captured by the British. It was while a British ship was towing the German destroyer along with another German vessel that it encountered a storm and the destroyer got lost. Nobody knew what happened, and to be honest, the British weren't too concerned. Number 2. The Beaumont. Archaeologists working in Antigua believe they've discovered the shipwreck of a French war vessel from the 18th century that was used by some of the original American colonists during the American Revolutionary War. The ship is called the Beaumont, constructed in 1762. Archaeologists found it, at least what they believe to be the Beaumont, at the bottom of Tank Bay, just 8 feet, 2.4 meters beneath the surface. The wreckage was found thanks to a diver named Maurice Belgrave, who told officials that he saw the large ribs of a ship somewhere at the bottom of the bay. From what experts can tell, the ship matches the Beaumont exactly. It's 130 feet, 39 meters long, and clearly an 18th century French vessel. The history of the Beaumont is actually quite fascinating. It only served the French military for 2 years before it was sold to an unknown individual who renamed it the Lion. The ship was eventually handed over to British colonists during the American Revolution, but was then captured off the coast of what is today Virginia by a British naval ship. What happened after that is a little foggy. It was brought to a dockyard in Antigua, which was controlled by the British, but there are no historical records of it after that. Nobody knows how it sank, though it may have been damaged during an unknown sea battle and just kind of abandoned. Number 1. Nazi warship. When divers discovered a World War II shipwreck, they were hoping to find some sunken treasure. At first, researchers believed the German steamship called the Karlsruhe, which sank back in 1945 near the coast of Poland, could contain treasures from the legendary Amber Room. When the wreckage was found just a little while ago, divers uncovered mysterious crates that they believed could contain valuable items. They also found rotting canvases, suggesting the ship had once contained valuable pieces of artwork. But just what exactly is the Amber Room, and why is it so important? The Amber Room was a literal room filled with some of the most precious treasure in Europe. It was built in 18th century Prussia in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, Russia. The room contained millions and millions of dollars worth of treasure, jewels, and famous works of art. The Nazis raided this room, stole every last piece of treasure they could get their hands on, and brought it back to Germany. But by the time the war was over, all the treasure had vanished. To this day, nobody knows exactly where the Nazis shipped the treasure or where they stashed it. This is why the discovery of the shipwreck was so exciting. When it left port, it had 360 tons of goods on board. The underwater archaeologists thought the Nazis had loaded the ship with the precious treasure from the Amber Room, only for the boat to sink. But as they learned after sifting through the wreckage in 2020, there was nothing in it except old war memorabilia. All those mysterious crates? Well, they only contained ordinary army gear, things like binoculars, gas masks, and other miscellaneous objects. There's still no sign of the missing treasure. Number 10. Space debris. This image of a space age-like structure on what appears to be an Arctic beach probably isn't real. We weren't able to trace it to anything that's actually known to exist. But it's a great way to get a conversation going about real instances of space debris appearing along coastlines, right? Take for example the time when a vacationer discovered parts from a SpaceX rocket during a trip to the Bahamas. During a getaway in 2015, Kevin LIEPAJA and his friends noticed something strange in the water approaching the beach. It turned out to be pieces of barnacle-covered wreckage from the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket booster, which had exploded and crash-landed just weeks earlier. The group quickly figured out what it was and tweeted to Elon Musk to let him know about their discovery. Musk replied a few days later thanking the friends for passing on the news, but he seemed uninterested in retrieving the debris. LIEPAJA and his buddies left it sitting on the beach. After all, what else were they going to do with it? And as exciting as it was to find the discarded hunks of metal, locals were concerned about how to remove it and how much it would cost, especially since there's no dump on Elbow Cay, the small island it washed up on. Shortly after that, SpaceX soon announced plans to come get the parts and properly dispose of them. Number 9. Pig-faced shark. Social media users went into a frenzy in September when naval officers on the Italian island of Elba posted photos of a dead shark with an eerily pig-like face. They had just discovered the carcass and apparently thought its homely face was interesting enough to share with the world. The creature is not deformed, like you might be thinking. It's an angular rough shark, and it's what they all look like. Some people call it a pigfish, not only because it looks like one, but because it emits a pig-like grunt when it's removed from the water. The species is common in the Mediterranean, but like most sharks, it's vulnerable to the fishing industry. Its numbers have been declining for decades, and it's one step away from becoming endangered on the International Union for Conservation of Nature (IUCN) Red List. The angular rough shark is one of many strange sharks that have been found in the region. In 2019, a 1-foot-long, 30.5-centimeter shark missing its teeth and its outermost layer of skin was found near Sardinia, Italy. After ruling out that it was a newly discovered species, experts were shocked to realize that the creature had lived for around 3 years. It grew at a normal rate, lived a relatively normal life, and was well fed despite its ailments. Researchers concluded that the so-called naked shark had a genetic mutation. They're unsure whether the mutation was natural or caused by chemical pollution, and said that they plan to continue investigating the matter. Number 8. Beached brains. During his daily morning walk along the beach in Racine, Wisconsin one day last year, local resident Jimmy Cinda spotted an object on the ground wrapped in aluminum and secured with a rubber band. Upon taking a closer look, he saw what looked like a human brain. To make things even weirder, the bundle also contained flowers and what appeared to be Chinese currency. Nearby city workers took a look and agreed with the baffled beachcomber that the object resembled a brain. Cinda called the police, and they too agreed with his assessment. The Racine County Medical Examiner's Office determined that it was a brain, but it didn't belong to a human. But it was still undeniably disturbing since someone had clearly taken the time to wrap it up, and with flowers no less. Nobody knows how and why the bizarre collection of objects ended up on the beach in Racine or who might have left them there. Cinda wasn't exactly thrilled by the alarming discovery that interrupted his peaceful morning stroll, but he told Fox 6 News that he was also glad for it in a weird way because it prevented any children from finding it. Good on ya, Jimmy. Good on ya. Number 7. LIEPAJA Northern Forts. The Latvian coast is home to the ruins of a collection of crumbling concrete bunkers. Known as the Northern Forts, they were built by Tsarist Russia between the 19th and 20th centuries. The long-abandoned structures once surrounded the entire coastal city of LIEPAJA and were part of its central fortress. They were abandoned in 1908, barely a decade after they were finished being built, because they were deemed to be a strategic mistake according to Latvia's official travel website. Authorities tried to blow the bunkers up with explosives in the past, but they were only partially successful. The ruins that survived the blast remain in place today, dotting the shoreline, but it appears as though the Baltic Sea may complete the unfinished demolition work as the unforgiving saltwater takes a toll on the structures. Some of these shelters have collapsed, others are still standing, but their days are arguably numbered in a losing battle against the elements. The site is open to visitors with guided tours, including one that has tourists play a game called Escape from the USSR. It entails a mock scenario where participants have to rescue a friend who was captured by the Soviets. Are you up for a round of Escape from the USSR, or does this not sound like your cup of tea? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Dead Seal Colony. In September 2020, Cape fur seals began turning up dead in large numbers on the Namibian coast. By mid-October, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 adult females appeared to have miscarried. Speaking with Reuters, KNUDE Dreyer of Ocean Conservation Namibia explained that most of the carcasses belonged to dead mother seals rather than pups. Scientists were at a loss to explain the mass die-off. They theorized that pollution, a bacterial infection, and/or malnutrition may have played a role. Some of the bodies were emaciated or at least thin with very little fat reserves, according to Dr. Tess Gridley of the Namibian Dolphin Project. But this wasn't the first time seals have perished en masse in Namibia. Back in 1994, around 10,000 dead seals and 15,000 fetuses appeared along the shore. A food shortage and bacteria were the suspected causes of death, but it seems as though experts failed to conclusively determine what happened. Number 5. NARLUGA Skull. Back in 1990, a hunter noticed 3 unusual-looking whales swimming off the coast of western Greenland. He managed to collect one of the creature's skulls, and it was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The animal had both beluga-like teeth and a bottom set of narwhal-like chompers, but it lacked the characteristic narwhal horn that the species is famous for. Narwhal researcher Mess Peter Heide Jorgensen suspected that the skull belonged to a hybrid between a narwhal and a beluga, or a narluga. Some researchers disagreed, instead theorizing that the animal was a deformed beluga. At the time, DNA technology wasn't advanced enough to glean any genetic information about the weird whale. The skull sat in storage for decades at the Natural History Museum of Denmark until a curator decided to take a fresh look at it in 2015. Technology had come a long way since the 90s, and scientists managed to extract some DNA. As it turned out, the creature was in fact a narluga with a narwhal mother and a beluga father. The skull is the first telltale evidence that a narluga hybrid was even a real thing. Before then, scientists thought it was nearly impossible for the two species to mate. Their shared gene flow appears to have diverged over 1 million years ago, and it's highly unusual for such distantly related animals to procreate with one another. An isotope analysis of its diet revealed that the creature probably dove even deeper than its parents in search of prey. Aside from these rudimentary details, not much is known about narlugas, and it could be a very long time before researchers get the chance to observe one of these extremely rare hybrids in the wild. Number 4. Rubber duck. While vacationing in the Russian Arctic 2 years ago, Vladimir Matusevich noticed a dirty rubber duck inscribed with the number 1417 resting on some beach rocks. He knew that it probably came from a rubber duck race. Yeah, it's a real thing. But these events are not common in Russia. Matusevich scoured duck racing event pages and groups on social media to try finding out where the one he found came from, and even created a Facebook page dedicated to his search. He sent countless messages to duck race organizers, and his hard work recently finally paid off. Monica Iverson, who helps organize the Ardmore Duck Race in Alberta, Canada, received a message from Matusevich in 2019 but didn't notice it until this year. She instantly recognized her handwriting on the duck and knew it was from her Ardmore event. When asked by CBC News if she was sure it was her duck, she said that she was 150% sure. The duck entered the water in June 2017. 2 years later, Matusevich found it more than 6,200 miles, 10,000 kilometers away. The annual Ardmore Duck Race has been going on for over 30 years. Local firefighters help collect the ducks at the end of the race, so it's rare for one to stray into the vast open sea. But number 1417 must have somehow slipped by unnoticed and continued its journey down the Churchill River, which empties into Hudson Bay. Ocean current expert Paul Myers explained in a CBC interview that the duck probably drifted through the Hudson Strait, around Quebec, and into the Labrador Sea, where it was swept away by the Gulf Stream. From there, it likely passed between Iceland and Scotland, then up the Norwegian coast to the Russian Arctic. The traveling toy has seen more in the past 2 years than many of us get to experience in our entire lifetime, and it'll finally be traveling back home to Alberta soon. Number 3. Giant snowballs. Locals were baffled in late 2016 when giant, nearly perfectly round balls of snow and ice littered an 11-mile, 18-kilometer stretch of coastline in northwestern Siberia's Gulf of Ob. The strange spheres ranged from 2.7 inches, 6.9 centimeters, about the size of a tennis ball, to as much as 3 feet, 1 meter in diameter. This has happened elsewhere, including along Lake Michigan, where boulder-sized ice balls weighing up to 50 pounds, 22 kilograms each, have appeared on the shore. In fact, they appear fairly regularly in the region, according to Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore Deputy Superintendent Tom Ulrich. To the typical onlooker, these frozen orbs seem too flawlessly round to be anything but man-made. But they're actually the product of a rare but naturally occurring phenomenon. Known as concretions, they form in a similar way to how a person makes a snowball. They start out as slush and small pieces of ice and grow as they're rolled by the wind in frigid water, sometimes becoming enormous in the process. The waves roll them ashore and deposit them on land as the tide recedes. Number 2. Strange shipwreck. While draining a man-made salt lake along Namibia's skeleton coast in 2008, a group of miners and geologists noticed pieces of wood and metal scattered along the shore. Soon after that, they discovered a buried shipwreck. Experts believe it's the Portuguese vessel Bom Jesus, which vanished along with its crew in 1533 while sailing from Lisbon to India. It's the oldest wreck ever found in southern Africa. It was also the first wreck in the region that was found laden with treasure, including gold coins and over 100 elephant tusks. A recent study traced the ivory to the African forest elephant. The species is native to the humid forests of West Africa and the Congo Basin. Until recently, scientists believed that they left their natural habitat for the dry savanna as recently as the 20th century, when overhunting and the ivory trade eradicated savanna elephants and opened up their territory to populations from elsewhere. But the 500-year-old tusks found on the Bom Jesus probably came from elephants that were killed near the coast, indicating that the creatures may have left the rainforests as early as the 16th century. The findings surprised experts who previously thought that ivory came from elephant species who stayed within different regions and habitats. But the study puts the animals in a mixed environment, showing that they ditched the humid forests of Central and West Africa long before hunters came along and nearly drove them to extinction. By learning more about the history of elephant hunting and the creature's movement, researchers can better address concerns revolving around the illegal ivory trade. Number 1. Massive pipes. 2017 was an eventful year along the Norfolk, England coast. Several months after $60 million worth of cocaine washed ashore, a dozen massive plastic pipe segments appeared on the beach. They were 8 feet in diameter, with the longest pipe measuring 1,574 feet, 480 meters long. The Titanic tubes were being transported from Norway to Algeria when the ship they were on got into an accident with a container ship. They became loose and fell off, and the waves carried them to land. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency reassured the public that the pipes did not pose any public health or safety hazards. But the Norwegian company that manufactured the stranded goods warned people to stay away from the segments to avoid possibly being crushed by them. The statement came after social media users began posting pictures of themselves standing on top of the pipes. Pipelife export manager Trygve Blomster told The Guardian that the tubes are especially dangerous when moving around in water. All it would take is a person falling off of one and having it rolled on top of them by the waves. Not to mention the 8-foot fall alone would be unavoidably painful. The good news is that the pipes weren't dangerous to the environment and nobody ended up being crushed by one. Thanks for watching. What's the weirdest thing you ever found on a beach? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.